Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first of our iGenet Conversations series. So what this is a little bit of a new thing we're doing, where we're going to have a very informal but very informative chat with some of our top star members of iGenet in the forum, our writers, our trainers, to talk about the work they do, to talk about some of their articles they've written for us, and the topics that they focus on. So we're going, again, as everyone trickles in, we're going to have a Q&A session at the end of this. Feel free to ask your questions in the Q&A session, and then I'll be asking them to Luba at the very end. We're going to get started with a little introduction here, and we'll go from there. So we'll start with this. Over the last year, artificial intelligence has taken the journalism industry by storm. For the potential for large language models like ChatGPT to automate or even replace some kinds of journalism work, to the newfound ease it takes to create AI-generated images. AI promises to be a part of how we do journalism in the future, no matter what, for better and for worse. But even while we're focusing on the potential positive impacts of AI and not just the negative, generative AI, or we call it GenAI, platforms like ChatGPT aren't without their biases. Pre-existing biases that underrepresent women and minorities can make their way into generative AI, and from there are further amplified by AI algorithms. The result is that generative AI quiets, distorts, and silences, if not outright erases, the voices of certain underrepresented groups, according to our guest today, Luba Kosova, in her recent iGenet article, 4 Biases That Leave Underrepresented Groups Out of AI-Assisted Journalism. Luba Kosova is an award-winning evidence-based storyteller, TEDx speaker, and author of the reports From Outrage to Opportunity, How to Include the Missing Perspectives of Women of All Colors in News Leadership and Coverage, and The Missing Perspectives of Women in the News. She's also a frequent contributor to iGenet, authoring stories highlighting the lack of news coverage of systemic gender gaps, the role of women journalists documenting the war in Ukraine, and more. Luba, I would like to welcome you to our first iGenet conversation. I'll start by asking you about your article in which you identified several ways that Gen AI can serve to further entrench underrepresentation, such as by who is sourced and considered experts by AI. Could you give us a brief overview of these biases?
Of course. Thank you so much, Devin, for inviting me. It's wonderful to be here and for your very generous introduction. I hope I live up to it today. So going to your question, so what I need to preface this talk with is that I'm not an AI expert myself. I'm an expert in, I'm a journalist and also expert in gender equity news. And where I came from when I decided to investigate these issues, I wanted to understand whose perspectives are missing from Gen AI-assisted news, and whether the biases that we see in society are exacerbated. And the answer very much is yes. And because I'm not an expert, I actually spoke with 10 experts in various aspects of AI, or senior news leaders who are actually working with figuring out how to integrate AI, if at all, in their newsrooms. And the 4 biases that I shall share with you today are a result very much of the research that I've done and the conversations that I've had. And also the mitigating strategies very much are aligned with the interviews that I did. So the 4 biases, the first one is to do with the data sets that are used in generating large language models, systems like ChatGPT. So we know that historically, the pool of material, whether it's science, literature, or journalism, in fact, is very much biased towards male voices. And these are the systems that go into the algorithms and then spew out whatever they do. So that's the first element and the first bias that is very much inherited, and that we spend fair amount discussing in our society and trying to mitigate and minimize. The second bias comes from the programmers themselves. So we all when we work on algorithms, there is what Joy Buolamwini, I'm sure I've butchered her name, in her Unmasking AI books, calls the coded gaze. And that means that programmers' preferences, values, but also prejudices are locked into the algorithms that they develop. Just to give you an example, for example, the technologies, the face recognition technologies that are used by police are based on, obviously, algorithms that have been developed based on recognizing features. So what becomes apparent is that 80% of the images used to recognize to develop this technology are those of white people and 75% of men. As a result of this, these technologies are incredibly accurate, 99 to 100% when they recognize white male faces. But the further away, or the more different you look from a white male, and for example, black women look very different from white men, then the accuracy goes down to 65%, which has enormous implications on the safety of women of color who are being subjected to these technologies, because that means there is such a large margin for of error. So that's the second bias. The third bias, and actually I want to mention another example in the context of large language models. So Kalev Litaru, who is the CEO of GDELD, that hosts more than 1 billion news stories that we've analyzed to death in our work in my consultancy, did last year a paper based on his work with experts, where they looked at ChatGPT to see whether how ChatGPT represents CEOs. So they looked at white men, CEOs of color, and CEOs who are women. And what they found is that when white CEOs are described, they're described according to their skills, so how skillful they are. But when you move to women or people of color, they're described by how resilient they are in the face of adversity and by their identity. So there is, and his conclusion from analyzing ChatGPT data is that there is a real dangerous racial and gender bias. So these are the first two biases. The third one is often overlooked. It's the early adopters who actually test the product, the early users of those products, whether they're image generators like DALL-E or Midjourney or Stable Diffusion or ChatGPT. And one of the people I interviewed is a journalist called Octavia Sheepshanks. Now, she is amazing because she's done deep research on child sexual abuse material on the image generators, which is incredible. It's so taxing, and yet she's doing it. And what she found is that often the users feedback through how they use the system, the early adopters, they actually teach the algorithm, because it's a looping process, and therefore it's no surprise that a lot of early users are very tech savvy, people who are really into for example, pornography, and that's why the vast majority of images can be non-consensual sexual images on these systems. So what do these three groups have in common? They tend to be white men from the global north. And in fact, again, in my consultancy, we recently came up with a term that I've now written about in some publications. We call them mowers. They are men who are older, white, educated, and richer. And in the case of tech, perhaps they're not even older, but they certainly are white, educated, richer. So that means that their biases, their preferences, their values are locked into the algorithms that then are taken forward. And groups like women or ethnic minorities or groups from the global south fall in the periphery. And what doesn't help in this instance is the fact that the prevalent culture is libertarian within big tech, meaning that they are looking to advance technology at any cost. And at best, there is moral ignorance around what's happening. At worst, there is apathy and lack of care about the fact that some groups are what Joy Bulamwini in Unmasking AI calls the excoded. Now, the fourth bias is to do with journalism that we all love and cherish. And how does journalism contribute to the gender bias? Well, in many ways, the two significant ways here are firstly, most tech editors, and forgive me, I do not have actually data here from the global south, but I can attest to a really strong gender bias in tech editors in the UK and US. About 18% of editors in the UK are women, and 23 in the US are women, or it might be the other way around. I'm so sorry. In any case, what we can conclude definitively is that the people who decide what constitutes a story in AI, for example, an AI story, overwhelmingly tend to be men. And in one of the articles that I wrote for you, I gave the example of looking when we analyzed GDEL data based on 5 million articles that mention the word AI. 5 men, including Sam Altman and Elon Musk and some others. So 5 men are mentioned 8 times more frequently in the news than 42 women who are deemed to be the AI experts according to Time's most influential people magazine. So with that comes the additional bias that the experts we're hearing from have a very narrow overview of what the challenges are, what the opportunities are. And what we're missing is more diverse perspectives to talk about this. So much so that Maite Taboda, who is a professor in Simon Fraser University that I also interviewed for this article, said that she doesn't trust the perspectives of the experts that are interviewed in the news, because she feels that the group that's being interviewed is so narrow. And this is on us, on journalists, that we're not interviewing more diverse group of people. So I'll stop here for a minute. This is basically an overview of the 4 biases. If you want me to dive deeper into any, please let me know.
So first off, I want to plug Lupa's article right here, 4 biases that leave underrepresented groups out of AI-assisted journalism. This is up on IGNet, so please give it a look if you want to dive a little bit further into it. I would like for you to go a little bit more into the specific role of journalists themselves in perpetuating biases. So you talked a little bit about how they're quoting more men than they are women or underrepresented groups who are experts. In your article, you write that there is a danger that journalists are also helping white women and other underrepresented groups out of the future of AI, kind of what you were talking about there. Is there any other ways that journalists are helping perpetrate these biases?
Well, these are the 2 main ways that they help perpetrate biases. And what makes the problem pernicious is that often journalists aren't aware of those biases. For example, there was the famous case of Ed Yong, who I think is a writer in the New Yorker, if I remember correctly. he did this experiment. He thought he was really gender equitable in his reporting until he started counting who he's talking to, and he found that he actually wasn't at all. So the reason, so often journalists believe, and they tend to be more progressive, so they think that they're very gender equitable, but they're not, and this is what makes it makes the situation harder. Also, we tend to give more prominence and weight to stories that are relevant to us and the communities we live in. And if the community that selects the stories, i.e. the editors, tend to be from one group, more likely to be white men, they are more also likely to exclude stories that are really important from a female perspective, or to women. So that's another way. For example, I wrote an article in The Guardian about the missing perspectives of women in AI, which created an avalanche of feedback on email and LinkedIn. And so many responded saying, but sending lists of women, female experts, saying, but they're all here. And there were some women who wrote to say, I'm an expert, no one's contacting me, I've done so much for this industry. And that's, again, I know I'm slightly repeating myself, but it is on us. And often, again, it's not a conscious decision, but journalists often are so time poor that they're going to the most obvious and mostly frequently used source, and those tend to be men. So it is in this way that we perpetuate those biases.
I want to. Oh, go
And
ahead.
just to finish, so sorry, just to give you one more stat, men are 3 times more likely to feature as protagonists or sources or experts in articles about AR than women. So it's actually quite a substantive difference.
Yeah. This is all really, I think, informative for us to just kind of like know the scale of the problem at hand. I do want to just make a quick mention to our participants. A few of you have hands up. Please, if you have a question, put it in the question and answer section, and we'll ask it at the end. Luba, I'm going to actually, let's move on towards the potential solutions here. So you have a follow-up article to your first. It's called 8 Solutions for Mitigating Gender Bias in AI-Assisted News. Again, everyone, go on IGNet, find it. I will also, I can provide those informations on our forum chat later. You identify ways that journalists can actually work to address the underrepresentation of Gen AI. Can you actually speak to the ways that like individual journalists or small newsrooms can best do so?
Yeah, so I think one of the quickest way of having impact, which is not going to be very costly, positive impact, is to create database of experts who are women, experts in generative AI that are women. So this literally is a project that is begging to be done, and I've been contacted so many times to put this list together. And what makes it really helpful is once you have that list, if you're a small newsroom, whether you're small or big, it's there, and individual journalists can spend less time looking for these experts. They can contact them, and once you've developed a relationship, then it becomes easier to approach different experts who are women. So that's perhaps the quickest way that one can make a difference. The other thing is to do what Ed Yong did, which is to go and look at your own coverage, take a week or however the last 10 articles that you've done, and do an audit, gender audit, to see what proportion of your contributors, experts, case studies are women, and whether there is any bias within that. Do you only use women as case studies and men as experts, or do you use them equitably? That's another thing to do. So I recently went to the International Journalism Festival in Perugia, and I then subsequently, in preparation for this session, I did an audit of all the AI sessions, of which there were 13 at the festival, to see what they were actually about. And only one of them was dedicated to bias. And that is so a plugin that's been developed by London School of Economics, fellows in London School of Economics, that is a bias blocker. And that essentially the way it works is and the reason why I mention it, because they want journalists to test it. So you can take that plugin, install it, and you can put in your article, and it will tell you whether the formulation of how you've written contains gender stereotypes. And moreover, it will also suggest ways of how you can rephrase things so that they're more gender neutral. So using plugins for free like that is also another way that journalists can really educate themselves and also help the industry by looping back their feedback and making the product better. And if you are interested, I can tell you about the 13 sessions on AI in International Journalism Festival, which is like a really good barometer of what's on journalists' minds. The 4 things that they were most concerned about is actually already moving forward to how to use and how to apply AI. And what concerns me here is that we need to be interrogating the data sets first, not go straight to application. So that's a real concern for me. So this was the most common way that a most common theme. Then approaches to regulating AI, very high level, principles of responsible AI, and how the effects of AI on the information ecosystem. So these were the 4, in my view, most common themes.
I'm seeing that biases in AI is not one of those most common themes that is being
No, and thank you for reiterating that point.
Yeah.
This is what really worried me, that we need to think about this before the AI is integrated into the newsrooms, and then it becomes impossible to really work and de-bias those systems. And I feel so passionately that we cannot have this marginalization of such big groups like women, ethnic minorities, people from the global south. It's just not right.
Well, let's actually talk about that on we were talking about underrepresentation in how individual and newsrooms can combat that. We also offered suggestions for industry-wide approaches to mitigating Gen AI biases. For example, creating a database of female Gen AI industry experts. You already talked about this. What are the editorial standards should be implemented across the industry? If we're thinking about industry-wide editorial standards for how to use AI and mitigate gender and underrepresentation bias, we're having a hard time using that word today. What would those be?
Yes, that's such a great question, as all the previous ones. So just in order to answer this question, actually, my consultancy, some of us looked at some of the guidelines that have been already produced around the use of AI ethically. And what struck me, and I've written that in the article, is that it's very much hit and miss, but mostly miss. For example, the Reporters Without Borders Paris Charter on AI, which was created with the help of 32 top-level experts across 16 partner organizations, doesn't mention bias, gender bias or bias as such. So that's, again, a reason for concern. But there is one guideline material. So BBC's machine learning, BBC machine learning engine principles, they're called, which felt like the most comprehensive thing we reviewed. And in them, they had 4 elements. Firstly, the necessity for any team working on AI to be multidisciplinary and as diverse as possible, which is really important in terms of diversity of thought and also highlighting and detecting different risks. Secondly, asking the question, are the data sets diverse in thought? And what I love about it is that they're auditing the data set before going to application, which is really important. The third is if the answer to the second question is the data sets are not diverse enough, the next question is what measures should be put in place to ensure that the diverse groups are heard, whether it's debiasing the system or whatever it is that needs to happen. And the fourth question is what are the sources that need to be included to make the machine learning or the algorithm more inclusive and more fair and to mitigate the bias. So that feels to me like a really good list of questions for organization, for the whole actually industry, to your point, to look at and address. And I can't iterate enough how important it is to be collaborative. One of the people I interviewed was Laura Ellis, who is the head of technology at the BBC, and she pointed out that these are very complex issues, and they are affecting absolutely every newsroom that is planning to have a relationship with generative AI. Therefore, instead of working in silos, there's never been a more important time for newsrooms to be collaborative, which I understand goes against the competitive fabric of journalism, but it's a really important thing to try and develop industry-wide initiatives that look at this stuff.
Amazing. Thank you, Luba. We're going to ask one final question to you, and then we're going to open up for a Q&A. So if anyone has any questions, please put them in the Q&A now, and then we will address them after this last question. So Luba, you also talked about some ways AI can be used to actually improve representation. You might mention this already, but one example is using it to measure women's shared voices in the news through tools like that Simon Fraser University's Gender Gap Tracker. What should journalists know about the positive potential of AI to address existing inequalities in the industry? How can we use AI, even if AI is perpetuating bias, how can we use AI to mitigate that?
So that's another great question. So there are some, as I mentioned now, the plugin bias blocker by LSE. There are some tools that are being developed to actually use AI to measure. And we could never use generative AI to mitigate the missing voice, because the way it works is it learns from the past and from reiteration. But what we can do using AI, whether it's generative or in fact natural language processing AI, what we can do is use it to measure bias, because the worst about bias is that we are not aware that we have it. So we could use AI to help us become more aware of our own biases. And this is what the Gender Gap Tracker, for example, does, that you mentioned already. It sifts through text to identify what proportion of the speakers are women versus men, and what proportion of the words that have been said can be attributed to men versus women. And they do so also by genre. So within health, what the proportion is, within entertainment, politics, and we can see a lot of gender stereotypes played out there, where women are much more likely to be prominent in art and education, and men in politics and more high profile agenda setting news beats like politics and economics. So that's one example. There is another example in Denmark called Media Catcher Company. The CEO is called Lars Damgaard Nielsen. They've developed a diversity catch, which actually works with podcasts, with audio, and with TV, where again you upload your program and they can recognize gender as well as ethnicity, although they're race, although they're not as good at race as they are at gender. And again, they can look at various metrics within that, how women are, what are women and ethnic minorities asked to contribute to, for example, talk about their identity versus being experts. So there are, and all of these systems we've just talked about, they're all based on AI. So using AI for the greater good, in that sense, for detecting gender bias. So there are some systems that are aiming to help stop or identify, stop gender-based online abuse. This is another way of really helping protect journalists, especially women, from the abuse that they sustain on a regular basis, and that drives many of them away from the profession altogether.
While we have a few more questions and answers coming in, I'm just going to ask you a very general question, but it's a bit of a far-reaching one, which is, you've been studying this, you've been doing reports on this. Where do you see the direction of concern, like the level of concern from this? Do you see that people are starting to recognize this, or do you still feel like the level of concern for underrepresentation in AI is just something that people aren't even considering?
Unfortunately, having looked at all the evidence, I can definitively say that gender equity is not on the radar enough in journalism or any other profession for that matter. And what we found when analyzing the missing perspectives of women in news and from Outraged Opportunity is that journalism is a mirror to society. And where we are in society at the moment, that there is a backlash against gender equality, which is gaining pace. There is backlash against gender equality, feminism. There is a sense that men have been left behind, that they're vilified, that they're not listened to. And that makes me even less optimistic. And the third reason why I'm less optimistic about the recognition is that in order, unfortunately, you need to strategically prioritize organizations to be gender equitable. And that costs money, and that you need to take resource from somewhere. And in an industry which is contracting, and which is now battered with yet another challenge, which is AI, it's hard to carve those resources. So I therefore want to be that voice reminding how important it is, but I'm not particularly optimistic that we've been galvanized yet.
That is a sobering but important point to land on. We're going to have a few questions here. One of them's a couple of people are asking this question, and I think we should just get it out there, which is that they want the link or the name of the plugin that was introduced at Perugia. Do you remember that?
So I have, how do I do this? I mean, if
we can also provide it later. We'll provide an email later.
It's if you go to Perugia to the program.
It's the International Journalism Festival.
International Journalism Festival, and you click on AI, which is one of the themes that they explore. On Saturday, the first talk was dedicated to that plugin. They were talking about how they developed it, what the challenges, etc. And that's where they actually give a link and they say, please use it.
Just for our audience here, what we'll be doing after this is posting a recording of this later, and I will add the links to this at the comments of the recording. So keep an eye out for that.
Thank you so much for doing that. I should have thought of it to send it to you in advance, but there you go.
We'll send it afterwards. I have a couple of good questions here. One of them is kind of talking about something you mentioned earlier, but I feel like it's good to kind of follow up on. This is from Pallavi Guha. Again, I apologize for if I don't say your name correctly. There are expert sources such as SheSource. How can journalists be encouraged to find diverse sources on such platforms like SheSource or other platforms like that? What would you say to journalists to encourage them to use it?
Well, what I would say is that it makes business sense to do so. If the moral argument isn't enough, which by all accounts it isn't, because we haven't made that much progress in the last 10, 15 years, then the argument that we found that really galvanizes editors that I interviewed for my reports, and I interviewed 41 editors from across the globe, is the economic argument, which is there is a case study from Outraged Opportunity that shows that there is enormous $11 billion opportunity to close 11 to 12% gender consumption gap between, which is in favor of men at the moment, if it is closed by 1 percentage points a year, more women are brought in without alienating the men. And the way to bring more women to consume the coverage is by making sure that their needs are reflected in the coverage. So the stories that matter to them are being told, and also they can recognize themselves. They see people like themselves in the coverage. And to do that, you need to obviously expand the pool of the people that we interview so that the stories we tell are more nuanced, they're more relevant to women as well as men. So that would be my pitch in terms of it makes business, and your coverage will be more appealing to broader audience and therefore make more money to the organization that you work for.
Perfect. We have a second question here. It's from Matt Lena from Finland. At Tampere University, we have developed an NLP news source tracker similar to gender gap tracker that identifies genders, but also other diversity dimensions. I would love to hear about your experience in tracking gender equality. In your experience, does it really work in a sense that it would help enhance diversity?
Enhance diversity,
Yeah.
did you say? Oh, so really a good example of change, positive change, is BBC's 50/50 tracker. So BBC introduced years ago their 50/50 tracker after a famous journalist, Ross Atkins, sat stuck in traffic in his car for many hours and found how on radio there wasn't a single female expert talking. That really galvanized him. So he started this whole initiative essentially, and now it's not only implemented by the BBC, but by many organizations in the world, in news and outside. So what they've done is they have very simple methodology where they track the representation of women in different programs or products. They track it, and they've set themselves goals. And because every journalist is responsible for doing their own tracking, that works positively in two ways. Firstly, you become more aware of your own bias. And secondly, you're responsible for making changes. And then you see how making changes impacts your output. So it has had a phenomenally positive impact. And they have, I think, largely reached 50/50 in terms of gender, BBC in their many of their products have. And then now they've expanded this, they're looking at ethnicity and they're looking at disability as well. So I think, I don't know if I'm answering the question, but it's certainly using systems that measure bias is incredibly helpful to change then to redress it.
I think it's a really good place for us to kind of look forward thinking to end here. I know we have a few more questions, but we're kind of coming to time here. Just kind of talking about there is ways that we can address this. There is ways that has had an impact, and there is ways that has had an impact on newsrooms, and therefore coverage is what we kind of want to be considering. And kind of as a final question for you, Lou, but kind of going off of what everyone else said, is there one message you would give for the journalist here about one thing they could do to help mitigate bias, especially if they're using AI, but otherwise just in general?
If I had to have one advice, that would be aware of it, that it exists, spread the awareness, and build out databases of experts in AI who are women that you generously share within the community, because I think that's step one. And it's a tangible and relatively easy step to take for change.
Perfect. Well, then, everyone, I want to thank you for coming and listening to Luba's perspectives. Again, please see her 2 articles on IGNet. I'm going to reiterate, this is, to plug them again, this is 4 biases that leave underrepresented groups out of AI-assisted journalism, and her follow-up, which is 8 solutions for mitigating gender bias in Gen AI-assisted news. You can find both of these on iGenNet, and I will also link them in the recording to this. The recording will be published within a day onto our group page. We had a little bit of troubles with going live today due to some new rules surrounding Facebook. So that'll be published along with some of the links, including the link to the Perusia plugin. Everyone, thank you so much for joining today. Luba, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
And we will see you. We will be in touch via Facebook and the group forum on all of our future webinars to come, including our next IJNet conversation. Thank you.